The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, delivered his budget yesterday. The headline announcements include corporation tax rising from 19% to 25%, increases to the annual tax-free allowances for pension savings and the abolition of the lifetime pension savings cap, skills boot camps to encourage people in their 50s who have left their jobs to return to work, known as returnships, a 3-month extension to the energy price cap, 30 hours of free childcare to cover 1- and 2-year-olds, scrapping work capability assessments for disabled benefit claimants and ramping up welfare sanctions, and tax breaks and other benefits for 12 new investment zones across the UK. The context of this was the Office for Budget Responsibility predicts the UK will avoid recession in 2023, and inflation is predicted to fall by the end of the year. But the economy will still shrink 0.2%, and on the day Hunt delivered his budget, doctors, teachers, civil servants and tube workers were on strike. So, Andrew, what was the politics of this budget? What was the government trying to do with it, and how did it land?
Well, the overall big politics is the grown-ups are back in charge. We're going to calm things down. We've got another year and a bit to show you we, the Conservatives, can run things relatively effectively. Within that, I would say it's sort of cross fingers, touch wood kind of budget, because although the OBR gives the Chancellor just enough wriggle room to say, do you know what, things are on course, the doubters are wrong, the British economy is coming back. If you look at the range of forecasts, we are in for a very, very tough couple of years. And the big problems, of course, for the Chancellor and the Conservative Party is what the OBR said about living standards, the worst or tightest 2-year squeeze in living standards since records began, coupled with the highest tax burden since the late 1940s and the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So I think people will look at the headlines, they will read the individual measures, and I think we should talk about childcare in particular, because I think that's really, really important in the context of a budget which is about trying to get more people back into the workforce. But I think people will, after they've read all of that, they'll ask themselves, how do I feel? How am I doing? Yeah. And the likelihood is the answer will be pretty negative, pretty bleak, which is why I think Keir Starmer sounded quite so confident and optimistic in his pessimism, if I can put it that way, politically, towards the end of the budget speech.
Well, do you think that it is tin-eared then for Jeremy Hunt to be saying, he talked a lot about stability, he said the plan is working, the optimists were right, the decliners were wrong. People, like you say, budgets are sort of retail moments, aren't they? People watch them to see, or watch the headlines of them to see what's in it for them. They're not going to be feeling that stability or that the plan is working.
This was not a budget for public sector workers, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well...
Yeah, like Andrew said, it's relatively good news in the short term from the OBR in terms of just scraping away from predictions of recession, but the long term prospects for growth in the UK are still not good. The growth potential of the UK economy is half what it was in the 10 years before the pandemic, and this was a relatively cautious budget that took some relatively small measures necessarily, because it did need to be a kind of boring budget in relation to the Kwarteng episode. And I guess the big question is, did it go far enough in addressing these systemic problems that will weigh on the economy in the long term?
There is a technical aspect to this which I'm sure Will understands much better than I do, but by the autumn and early next year, most economists tend to think that Jeremy Hunt will have a much larger amount of money to use, to give away, if you like, than he has at the moment, because a fifth year of OBR predictions comes into play. Now, don't ask me to explain the details of that, please. But the point is that this is also a kind of marking time budget to a certain extent. And I think we can expect a much more dramatic budget from the Chancellor, an extra budget later this year in the autumn perhaps, or indeed about this time next year, ahead of a general election. And then the really big question is, what does he use that extra amount of money for? Does he use it to cut taxes, as the Conservatives still desperately hope, or does he use it to actually buy off some of these strikes across the public sector, to give public sector workers a little bit of the pay rise that they desperately need?
Yes, so sort of like a pre-election budget.
Exactly.
Yeah. And, well, does that really work? Because obviously there are a lot of tax rises snuck into this budget. Because of stealth tax rises.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to remember that Jeremy Hunt, when he ran for the leadership in 2019, he was talking about cutting corporation tax to 12%. So, he was at the extreme end of the tax cutting spectrum, and now is sort of supporting the continuation of the rise to 25% and giving businesses tax breaks to do so. But in terms of workers, as you say, that he's frozen the thresholds, which amounts to a really significant rise in income tax. So that those thresholds frozen to the 2027-2028 tax year amount to the same as putting an extra 4% on income tax. Well, that's from the OBR's report yesterday. So, that would be politically extremely difficult to get through, a 4% rise in income tax. But that's what it amounts to. And when you look at people's marginal rates of tax, as in the extra tax that they pay on a pound earned here and there, those distortions are still there. So that mean that somebody who has, for example, 3 children and is earning between 50 and 60 grand a year has a marginal rate on the extra money they earn if they get a pay rise of about 68%.
Wow.
There's a distortion now with the free childcare benefit, which means that if you earn just under 100,000 a year and you get a pay rise that takes you over that, you could lose up to £6,000 because you don't get the same benefit anymore. So, obviously, there will be a lot of people out there who will be playing the very smallest violin at the thought of people on 6-figure salaries having to take a hit. But that is a measure that would discourage some people from perhaps doing the extra work that would take them over that pay level. And if those distortions exist,
this is nightmarish, isn't it, for Tory MPs? These are huge tax rises.
Picking up on what we were saying, this shows you how effective stealth taxes really are. Because if Jeremy Hunt had stood up and said, you know what, I'm going to put 4p on the basic rate of income tax, every single front page of every newspaper will be printed in black ink and saying this is the end of the Conservative Party. And yet it's happened effectively, and barely anyone has noticed.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
And it buys him that fiscal headroom that you were talking about, because I think by the same year, by the end of the frozen period that's currently scheduled, it adds up to almost 30 billion a year in extra money for the Exchequer.
Right, and so Tory MPs are willing to wear this. They haven't noticed, or they haven't made a big thing about the stealth tax rises because they're willing to wait for next year or perhaps the end of the year for something a bit more juicy for them.
What they're doing is they're looking at Rishi Sunak, and they're looking at some of his recent successes, by which I mean particularly the Northern Ireland Protocol negotiations and the opening again of warmer relations with the EU. And they're beginning to think, you know what? It's possible. It's just possible that this guy might not lose me my seat in the election. It's just possible that if I listen to them and I don't go mad and I don't rebel, I might actually hold my seat. And it's that sort of, as it were, intake of held breath at the moment, I think, inside the Conservative Party,
right,
that he explains partly that they are putting up with things in the budget they really, really don't like. I talked to Simon Clarke, who was, of course, quite prominent in the short-lived Liz Truss administration and has set up the Conservative Growth Group of MPs. They've had a big input into parts of this budget. He hates the idea of corporation tax going up like this, but he said, I just have to be restrained. I can't go too far. I understand the political mood. The other thing we should say is that Rishi Sunak has been bringing in groups of Tory MPs face to face. He's been having literally hundreds of conversations under the radar quietly over the last few weeks saying, please, please don't rebel. I am your last chance, and here's how we're going to do it.
Right, wow, okay. And in terms of what they're trying to do with this budget, it's getting people back into work. I was speaking to Brits on low incomes who depend on benefits yesterday to ask them how they felt about it. And they were telling me that actually sanctions and even incentives and the conditionality that they're building into the benefit system doesn't help, because if you're not working and you're on benefits, most likely it's because you're disabled, you're ill, or you have other responsibilities. You might have care responsibilities, for example. And so they were saying that this might not necessarily work and might make life more miserable for them, which can make you unwell and, again, less likely to work in the long term. Will, are any of these measures in the budget likely to get more people back into work?
Well, Possibly. I mean, I think I guess the reason that he is so focused on getting people back into work is that having people out of work, having people retire early, for example, is an inflationary pressure because it leads to a tighter labour market. The more vacancies they are, the more bargaining power workers have for their wages. Therefore, that can push wages up higher. It is an understandable aim within the context of his big stated aim to halve inflation. But that you can have all sorts of unintended consequences from doing so.
Absolutely. And also, on the other side, on the growth side, the fact that 2/5 of adults in England are economically inactive. 2/5 is a huge problem for the government. If you want growth, you need to get people back into the labour market. I think the badly thought through bit of this was raising the lifetime threshold on pensions for relatively well-off people, the so-called doctor's tax issue, because you can deal with NHS doctors, you can keep them in the workforce with a specific measure, as Rachel Reeves has pointed out, such as they used for judges. You don't need to have this big blanket measure, £1 billion, which will allow the Labour Party to say these Tories with no money are nonetheless spending £1 billion on very rich people. So that bit, intended to get people in their 50s to stay in the labour market, I think is badly thought through. But I think the childcare measures are very welcome indeed. And there are lots and lots of calculations or guesstimates, frankly, about how many women would be back in the labour market, would be working if they had access to more affordable childcare. But that could be a very, very large number of women, 700,000 to 1 million women back in the workforce. So I think that is really significant. If that works, it will have a measurable effect on the entire economy.
Yeah, because there are some questions over the childcare policy, even though it has been welcomed, by most groups, because it juices up demand, but it doesn't necessarily give the supply that you need. And, if you live...
And not for another 2 and a bit years. I mean, it comes in fully only in 2025, I think.
Yeah. And in terms of those pension relief measures, I think the OBR forecasts that those 2 measures that they introduced will increase employment by just 15,000 people at a cost of £47,000 per job. So is it just an expensive bung for the already wealthy, Will? Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually seen another estimate, I think it's from the Resolution Foundation, that said it could cost £80,000 per job.
Wow.
The limit on the amount that you could put into your pension was brought in for 2 reasons. So it was brought in to encourage people to save for a decent pension, and it was brought in to stop people avoiding paying tax by dying and passing their pension on to their children, and allowing people to get around the tax they would have paid on their income there. Actually removing it without addressing those quite significant concerns for a lot of other people in the economy could have some unintended consequences. And
avoiding paying tax by dying is a strategy which I hadn't considered.
It's widely used, I think.
So in terms of how this looks to the general public, I mean, will they see the fact that there's some tax relief for the very wealthy and not necessarily much for them, aside from this childcare policy that we know will make a big difference to a lot of people's lives, and of course the extension of the energy price cap?
To be honest, I don't think this is a budget that changes the political dial at all, really. They've got through budget week without any obvious huge disasters, and that's fine. But really, it's all about what happens to the economy over the next 2 years. It's about growth, and it's about how people feel. And the OBR forecast is right at the top of optimism in terms of the predictions. You look at the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee assessment of where we're going, and it's really very bleak indeed. And most independent forecasters are between the two. So I don't think Jeremy Hunt knows what's going to happen to the economy over the next 18 months to 2 years, nor does anybody else really, but it doesn't look good. And you can see Keir Starmer focusing on asking people, do you feel better or worse off than you did 13 years ago when the Conservatives came into power? And the statistical answer is worse off by quite a way. He is basically saying to people, whatever you do, don't forget. Don't forget Liz Truss. Don't forget Boris Johnson. But above all, don't forget how you felt right at the end of the new Labour years when things just seemed to be rosier and happier and you're more prosperous and you're more optimistic. Don't forget.
Yes, well, this is the Reagan question. It's the question Reagan used. He said, do you feel better off than 4 years ago? I've been speaking to people in Labour about the use of this question. The reason they're so confident about it is even if inflation falls, doesn't mean prices fall. It just means you're getting poorer slower. So they know that people aren't going to feel better off anytime soon, which is interesting. You mentioned this earlier, Andrew. You know, there were sounds of protesters, you know, people striking and marching outside of Parliament. So many of public sector workers were on strike yesterday, and it sort of seemed like a parallel universe. There wasn't anything in this budget for public sector pay. There wasn't an NHS sort of healthcare workforce strategy. There are some whisperings that there might be a deal with the health unions, but what about all of the other workers?
Well, this is the real big choice, I think, for Jeremy Hunt later in the year. This time round, he could say just about things had to be so tight, I couldn't possibly go out and give proper pay rises to all the people who want it and need it. That's just life, he said. You know, I have to be responsible. I have to let the economy recover and grow. I mean, he used the word crash about Liz Truss, which I thought was fascinating. So he can just about get away with it. But as more money becomes available, as Will was explaining, then the big choice is this. Do you give it in tax cuts to the better off, or do you actually use it for pay rises for public sector workers? And that is a choice which can't be forever delayed.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Will.
Thank you.
That's the end of the first half of this episode of the New Statesman podcast. And if you want to watch the second half, do stick around and find out more.